All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second session of the IDs and Diagnoses webinar series from the State Master Gardener Office. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type them in the chat box, and then we'll get to as many of those as we can after the presentation. Today's session is being recorded and it will be posted to our webinar archive later this week. And if you weren't able to attend last week's session or aren't able to attend any future sessions, all the webinar links will be, all the recordings will be posted there. So without any further ado, I am pleased to welcome Eric Day, the manager of the Virginia Tech Insect ID Lab. Welcome, Eric. Thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Well, happy to be here. I wish I was seeing everybody in person, but I could have garlic with lunch today. You know, maybe that's the only advantage, I guess, to doing these Zooms, but this will work. I've also pared down my talk from normally about 2 hours to 1. So hopefully I haven't left too much out. I think mostly what I'm going to talk about today is going to be the diagnosis of insect and mite damage. And so it's kind of trying to hit on some of the things you might see coming through the lab. I'm also talking through your offices, and also talk a little bit about some of the new things that are out there. So yes, we will talk about murder hornets, and the spotted lanternfly. I have to. So, but we'll cover all those things, and hopefully have enough time left over for questions. I kind of keep an eye on the clock as well too. As a disclaimer, I mentioned to Kathleen, I have rural broadband, so hopefully it'll all make it through. It came a lot of wind last night, but everything seems to be working. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I guess I'm sharing so right now, and I guess I'm assuming that everybody can see that. I may get a thumbs up or something on that. That would be good. So good. All right. Okay. All right. So this is going to be basic entomology, and what I'm going to try to cover, again, insects and mites, particularly as what you might find in the backyard and garden situations. So it's going to be a real quick rundown, but I'm kind of, again, also going to try to look mostly at diagnosing and insect damage, mite damage, that sort of thing. So with that, we kind of have to first sort of think about what is an insect. I think most of us know what it is. We can take a look at it and say that's an insect for sure, but kind of technically, what is an insect? And so these are invertebrates. They lack a backbone, and they have the hard exoskeleton. They have 3 body regions: the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. They typically have antennae. Well, they all have antennae. They can be long or short, sometimes so small you don't see them, but most of the time very visible. Most adult stages of insects have wings. There are some big examples of ones that don't. The one that I see actually in my kitchen, you might see out there too, are ants. Ants are adult stages that lack wings. Immature stages of insects always lack wings. You're not going to see a baby insect flying around or something like that. All right, the insects are in this class Insecta, but their Insecta is broken down into 27 or so, plus or minus, orders of insects. And some of the orders are things we are very familiar with as a group. So the biggest group are the Coleoptera, the beetles. Next to the Lepidoptera, the moths, butterflies, caterpillars, cankerworms, cutworms, all those things are in Lepidoptera. The Hemiptera are your true bugs, aphids, cicadas, stink bugs. There used to be a separate order called the Homoptera. That may even be in some of your manuals, but the Hemiptera is now what all those insects with piercing, sucking mouth parts are in. Diptera, true flies, things like your just housefly and gnats and that sort of thing. Hymenoptera, bees, wasps, hornets, everything like that. Thysanoptera, thrips, which are a tiny little insect, but has a big impact on plants. Plus about 22 other orders. So there's a lot of other groups of insects out there too that have their own order. But this first group I gave you here, this first 6, is kind of going to cover most of the pests you're going to see out in your garden or in a backyard. All right, what is not an insect? And there's a few other things too, some other pesky invertebrates. Mites are not insects, they're arthropods. They have an exoskeleton. They have 8 legs, but they're not technically an insect. Spiders, closely related to mites, also 8 legs, 2 body regions, whereas the mites just had 1 body region. Spiders are an amazingly beneficial group of arthropods because they are the dominant biological control out in gardens. So we do get a lot of benefit from having spiders around. Sow bugs or crustaceans, also known as pill bugs, roly-polies, that sort of thing. But they're crustaceans, so they're more closely related to something like a lobster or a shrimp. And then we have the snails and slugs, the mollusks, and we don't really have too many snail problems in Virginia. We do have a couple snail species that are invasive. They're showing up, but for the most part, we deal with slugs. And they're native slugs, and they can be serious problems, particularly on things like hosta, sometimes in gardens, sometimes in no-till corn for farmers. And we'll talk about those coming up. Right away, we're talking about them. So slugs and snails, but slugs in particular, chew these ragged holes in leaves. They also leave this characteristic slime trail as they go. And so there's a couple things to use to diagnose them. There are also slugs do very well when you have high organic moisture and, I'm sorry, start over. Slugs do very well when you have a lot of organic matter. All right, trying to work it out. Okay, organic matter and moisture. So those are kind of a couple things that you typically think of as really good for the garden, and they are, but they're also really good for the slugs. And that's kind of one of the things, a conundrum you deal with in vegetable gardens and backyards is a lot of times the things you do that are good for the plants are also good for the pests, unfortunately. Slugs are controlled pretty well with slug baits. There's a number of them out there. Some of them have iron phosphate, some of them have boric acid or spinosad, and sometimes it can be combined with beer or yeast bait, and something like a snail trap. There's other versions of snail traps out there. So, and I also kind of want to talk about this too. Something that comes up a lot is, well, gosh, my grandmother always put out a pan of beer and that took care of all the slugs. Well, and there's a lot of home remedies and a lot of home remedies for other pests too. They're not backed up by replicated university research, which is kind of what Virginia Tech is all about. But yet these home remedies oftentimes work very well. So there's things like crushed oyster shells, which is a chicken feed supplement, putting that around the base of the plant to discourage the slugs. You can put beer baits out. Some people will put like a shallow pan with the beer bait in there, or sometimes like a bulb planter and put a can in there and pop the top in there. We like to do replicated university research on beer baits, but if you ever try to requisition beer with a purchase order, it doesn't always go very well. So that's kind of just a sort of something to think about. You do get a lot of inquiries on home remedies, and as I mentioned, some work very well, but you got to kind of keep in mind that there's no university research to back them up. All right, so next I talk about the some mites, and that's kind of still arthropods, or now we're kind of into arthropods. With mollusks, we're not. So mites have 8 legs, piercing mouth parts. So they are piercing a couple cells at a time, often as they feed, leaving a little small spot or a stipple. There are many, many families of mites. Most mites are actually beneficial. They're either predatory or scavengers. Couple families can become pest problems. And these are the Eriophyid mites, also known as gall mites and rust mites, and the Tetranychidae, which are spider mites. 2 basic groups of the spider mites are cool weather mites and warm weather mites. We'll talk about that here coming up. Damage is much easier to see than the mites. So the mites are fairly small, millimeter or 2 in length. This is the most common mite you're going to come across out in gardens and on house plants, etc., greenhouses, 2-spotted spider mite. And this is named by the 2 spots, which are actually clear areas in the body wall. So you're looking at their gut contents, essentially. These things are, again, about a millimeter or 2 in length. You can actually see some eggs there on the I don't know if my cursor will show up. There's like some eggs there on the leaves as well too. Notice the eggs are pretty good size in comparison to the mite, and this is typical for spider mites. They lay fairly large size eggs, but they can also have lived long enough to lay a lot of eggs, and you can see populations build up very, very fast with them. So two-spotted spider mite is commonly found on beans, but has many, many other hosts. Hot, dry weather can facilitate a very quick buildup with as short as 8 days from egg to adult if you have optimal warm weather conditions in the summer. So you see things like yellow foliage spots, webbing. So insecticidal soap or miticides work very well. I think for the homeowner, the backyard situation, insecticidal soaps are going to be the only option because the miticides that are labeled for mite control are generally all restricted use. Removing the weeds in the winter and summer. And this works for some other pests out there too, but remove the weeds in the summer removing the weeds in the winter and the summer gets rid of the mite harborage or places that they can develop in. Hot spots, so you get areas next to sidewalks, next to bare earth, and so that they tend to be places where the mites build up much better. Another thing too is they can get moved about. They can hit you right on the garden hose you're dragging through the garden, on your clothing, et cetera, and get moved about the garden that way too. All right, this is some oak mite damage, oak spider mite damage. And as I mentioned earlier, the damage from mites is often easier to see than the mites themselves. And this is fairly typical kinds we call stippling. You can see some individual tiny little yellow spots where one mite was feeding. You get a large number of spots. The spots kind of coalesce together. You can also see some white flakes there along the midrib of this oak leaf, this white oak leaf, and those are the cast skins of the mite. So that's something you also will see too. So, but the mites are not often as easy to see, and often by the time it gets to be this stage, the mites might be gone, and they're done feeding. They moved to an overwintering site, and so that would also be important as far as doing some kind of control. That the controls are not going to be very effective once, obviously, after the mites are gone. Spruce mite is very common on not just spruce, but on hemlock, arborvitae, juniper, etc. It doesn't show up too much on your pines, but you see it on those other non-pine conifers. So right now, it would be in the overwintering stage when we find the egg. But if you get into about late April or early May, then you start seeing them hatching and activity of the mites, and they would be moving around. So again, very tiny, just a millimeter or so in length, but you can see that their damage is very pronounced. You can see that picture to the right is that you can see the actual feeding sites or stipples that are there from the spruce mite feeding. All right, some other things to look for spruce mite. So sometimes that stippling is so heavy, it looks as though the plant's sandblasted. So you can see that Fraser fir foliage there where they're yellow, particularly the base of the needles, really sort of sandblasted look, really typical for mites. So when you're seeing that sort of thing, the first thing you're going to want to do is maybe get a hand lens, take a look, see if you can see some of the mite cast skins or the mites themselves too. You can also do a tap test where you can wrap the foliage against a white sheet of paper and then take your hand and smear the mites and leave little red streaks. And that's a way to kind of tell if you actually have some mites active at that time. This is southern red mite, and southern red mite is a cool weather mite. Like the spruce mite, it's active predominantly in May, and then again in say late September, early October. Southern red mite gets on your non-pine evergreens, so it's going to be on rhododendron, holly, azaleas that keep their leaves. Any of your non-pine evergreens are going to be potential hosts for the southern red mite. You can see a number of things here in this picture. One is the mites themselves. You can see their eggs there that are red. Those are unhatched. You can see some eggs that are hatched. The top of the screen, you can see some little kind of clear spherical items there, and the eggs that have hatched and the mite has left. The little white flecks on there are the cast skins. So again, as typical for spider mites, and the southern red mite is a spider mite, the egg is fairly big comparison to the actual adult stage of the mite. All right, so I kind of already covered a lot of these as far as basic control of mites. Look near hot spots, walls, bare earth, sidewalks. Tap tests for the mites, so they may be gone, particularly in the middle of the summer or the middle of the winter. These cool weather mites are not going to be there. Treatment is usually going to be April or May for southern red mite, to midsummer for two-spotted spider mites. A two-spotted spider mite is a hot weather mite, and it's going to be mostly active in, say, July and August. Ornamentals, dormant oil in late winter is going to work in a lot of situations. So treating spruce, boxwood, etc. in late winter with dormant oil is going to take care of the egg stage, the overwintering stage of the mites, and provide fairly good control. Gardens, insecticidal soap about midsummer or when you start to see activity. Coverage is very important, obviously, because these things can be on the other sides of the leaves or on the stems. So you want to make sure you get very thorough coverage of the plant. All right, moving away from mites, we're kind of going to now work our way into insects and talk about a very unusual group that is often overlooked just because they're very tiny size. And these are thrips, and thrips in the order Thysanoptera. The common name is thrips, and it's an old English name, so you can have 1 thrips or 10 thrips. It has the S on the end if it's singular plural. They have very unusual feathery wings. That picture there to the left, you can see they look like little stalks, the fringe of hair, and that's really essentially what they are. The thrips themselves are only a couple millimeters in length. They're very tiny, but they feed inside the buds of plants, vegetative and flower buds. And so that damage becomes magnified and the leaves become puckered. The fruit can be deformed, you can have black spots, or all kinds of other types of damage. They do respond pretty well to insecticidal soap. So if you find the thrips, then you should be able to do pretty good control with insecticidal soap. They can become very common in dry years, particularly as hay fields are drying down, being cut for the first time. You can sometimes have huge thrips migrations coming into gardens. And they're actually attracted to shiny surfaces. So very commonly they land in swimming pools, and you get like a yellow sheen from all the thrips that are present on there. They're a big issue for greenhouses, big issue in floral gardens. That dead flower that you see there on the top of the picture, that's really common in chrysanthemum roses, where you have just the plant looks okay otherwise, but it's got the flowers turned completely brown. Very typical kinds of thrips damage. They're also known unusually as thunderbugs. They tend to move a bit more just on the fronts that are coming in, or thunderstorms too. And they have a really unusual ability with their static charge is different than the air, and so they get picked up and get moved around particularly during thunderstorms. All right, still staying with insects with piercing, sucking mouth parts, kind of moving on to aphids. And so aphids are enough that you can usually see them with the unaided eye. And so they are soft-bodied. They're going to be, more in the range of 5 or 10 millimeters in length, maybe anywhere between 1/8 and 1/4 inch and so in length. Often a pale green, reddish, yellowish color. They tend to blend in with the foliage or the leaves. Sometimes you'll see some white cottony material associated with them, but usually the thing you see is just the huge numbers of them present when you have a big population. One thing you might is honeydew, and so you get this clear droppings that come down from the plant, and they feed with piercing, sucking mouth parts. They're feeding the liquid portions of the plant. They're primarily going after the proteins and amino acids. So their droppings are very high in water and sugar. And so it's clear, sugary, sticky, and it gets the name honeydew. You can actually then get a non-pathogenic fungi growing on it called sooty mold, but it does block enough sunlight on the leaves. It can be an issue in that way. Many different species. Some are host specific, some are generalists. So some will only be on one type of plant. Some will be in a really wide range of them. They are often tended by ants. The ants like to feed on those droppings on that honeydew, and they will defend the aphids from parasites and predators and that sort of thing. Your old publications may put them in the order of Homoptera, but they're now definitely in the order of Hymenoptera. I kind of talking about that a little bit earlier there too. A couple of things about the aphids too. They, I already mentioned, they're in a wide variety of plants. We try to promote vigorous growth, but not too much nitrogen. So you might think that's the thing you should do if the plant's struggling, got a lot of aphids. Maybe it needs a shot of nitrogen, but the nitrogen makes the plant much more nutritious. The growth is much more tender. It makes it much easier for aphids and other insects to feed on it. So definitely want to do a soil test. And I know Steve talked about that last week, but do a soil test and put down the appropriate amount of nitrogen. Don't overdo it, or you may end up with not just aphid, but you can have mite issues as well too. Again, insecticidal soap does a pretty good job, or even just a strong stream of water too. Some of the basic aphid anatomy, I just kind of want to point out one thing is there, a couple things there. One, at the end of that aphid there, that real stylized aphid, you can see these things called cornicles. They look like little tailpipes. And aphids all have some type of cornicle. There may be variation in their length or their coloration, but those cornicles are usually emitting pheromone or other attractants for the aphids to congregate together. Then this is an example, most of the aphids on the foliage that are full-sized are adults that are wingless. So they're wingless adults. Aphids monitor for distorted foliage, monitor for honeydew or sooty mold, and look for natural enemies. I'll talk about it here just coming up in a minute. Insecticidal soaps, again, do a really good job, but just make sure you apply it when the aphids are present. So they're, sometimes they can be long gone, but the damage, the honeydew, the sooty mold, everything will be there kind of long after they move on. So a number of things that will show up as far as predators or parasites of aphids, and there, that top two pictures are are lady beetles, and the very picture at the top left is a larval stage of a lady beetle, and that's actually the Harmonia oxyritis, or the multicolored Asian lady beetle. The one there on the top right one is a 7-spotted lady beetle, which is actually a non-native lady beetle, but it's the dominant lady beetle you see out in gardens, and they eat a lot of aphids. They're very beneficial. They were accidentally introduced from Europe, much like the multicolored Asian lady beetle was too. At the bottom are a couple parasites. So Aphelitis culmini is a parasite of aphids. And when you've come across a parasitized aphid, it looks very different. It's tan, it's kind of a little bit blown up, and that'll have a little parasitic wasp inside. Sometimes you actually see those, they have like a little hatch door has been cut out of the back, and that means the parasite is left, but that will stay on the foliage for a long time afterwards. Some other things you might see out there feeding on aphids is going to be things like lacewings. And now the lacewing adults you'll see out there, that they get the name from the lacy look to their wings, but it's actually a larval stage that does a lot more as far as feeding on the aphids. And they're long and slender, these long piercing sucking mouth parts themselves, and these lacewing larvae then pick up the aphids and feed on them. Another thing too are syrphid flies, and the syrphid flies are bee mimics or wasp mimics. So you see the syrphid flies also as hover flies hovering around, or news bees, and they will be hovering around, but they have a black and white pattern, look like a bee. And then the larval stage of the syrphid flies or the hover flies are these legless, headless maggots that crawl through aphid colonies and terrorize the aphids. Kind of all of these combined actually provide a lot of biocontrol. So it's always kind of good idea to kind of look around and see if these things are in action, because you may be about to have the population crash because these things feeding on it. You may not need to apply control. This is Harmonia oxyritis, or the multicolored Asian lady beetle. It's not only a non-native species, it's also been an excellent source of urban legend. We first discovered in Virginia, 1993 in Lee County, and that was in spring of 1993, and by the end of 1993, it was almost in every county in the state, spread very quickly. Although the USDA did a number of releases for this beetle, they were never successful. They could never recover them at that site. The first detection of this multicolored Asian lady beetle was near the port of New Orleans, Alveda Springs, Louisiana, and has spread ever since. Well, spread very quickly in the early 90s. It became a very common house invader. I could walk down the hall here in my house and there's a big cluster of them at the end of the hallway. It is amazing the kinds of things people will tell you, or they'll say, well, so-and-so told me that they came from the Forest Service or from Virginia Tech or whatever. It's just amazing. We kind of collect where people say these things they think they came from. I had one person irately call me up and say they saw the Tech helicopter take off from Roanoke Airport and they saw the lady beetles, so therefore we did it. So it just, was almost almost every day we were getting those calls at one point. Not so much anymore. Good thing. So, but anyway, it's probably pretty good biocontrol. It feeds on aphids in trees. You don't really see it feeding on aphids in gardens. So that's gonna be one downfall from it. It's probably caused the extinction of the number of native lady beetles. So that's another issue kind of all by itself. But good old multicolored Asian lady beetle is named because of the location in the color, the size of spots, and that sort of thing too. So more biocontrol, and because this is a question you'll get a lot, and so I kind of already touched on some things like a 7-spotted lady beetle. Praying mantises are good. You can buy the egg masses. Praying mantises are what you consider a generalist predator. They will feed on anything, including each other. So if you let an egg mass hatch in your house in the middle of the winter, there's not really many insects you can collect from outdoors to feed them, and the praying mantises are going to be eating each other. So lacewings have a very unusual egg. There at the bottom row, the middle picture shows a lacewing egg, and it is actually an egg on a little stalk. You can see those out in the garden. All right, moving back to pests. Crepe myrtle bark scale is one that's a bit in the news. And kind of sort of shorten my talk here a little bit, I decided to only have this as the only scale in there. And there's certainly other scale insects, and some have been fairly serious pests in there. But the crepe myrtle bark scale has been detected in more and more places. Detected about 5 years ago in Norfolk, Virginia Beach area, but now we're seeing a lot of northern Virginia locations. So pretty much wherever crepe myrtle can grow and survive is a potential site to see this crepe myrtle bark scale. So it's white or gray. It's a pink hemolymph. So hemolymph is the blood. You can see if you kind of smear them a little bit, they have a purple streak, and it actually tells you too if they're alive or not. So maybe that might tell you if the control worked, if you're putting some type of control down. They exude honeydew, and then you see the honeydew and then sooty mold all over the bark, all over the trunk, all over everything. The best control for backyard situations is probably going to be dormant oil in late winter. And this has a lot to do with a very long and late blooming period for crepe myrtle. And so you do not want to be applying any kind of insecticides when they're in bloom, because you don't want to have any potential issues for the bees. So I think that for the most part, you're looking at some type of dormant oil application. So there's some other things in the PMG as far as systemics. Systemics do a good job, but there's also some contact insecticides that work well on the crepe myrtle bark scale. But again, you got that issue with a very long blooming period, and you don't want any kind of insecticides present when you have potential of bees visiting these plants. Spotted lanternfly. It's I've been at tech a long time, and there's kind of this time before spotted lanternfly and time after spotted lanternfly. Spotted lanternfly has been in Virginia are known to be in Virginia about 3 years. It was detected in January of 18. Scientific name, Lycorma delicatula, catula, not actually a fly, but a bug. It's related to leafhoppers and cicadas. Originally from China, based on DNA analysis, found in southeast Pennsylvania in 2014. Survived polar vortexes. The question I get, these cold winters will knock them out, right? Even Patuxawani Phil telling us we're going to have 6 more weeks of winter. It's still going to, spotted lanternflies are going to do A-OK with that, unfortunately. Discovered in Frederick County in 2018 by the Virginia Department of Agriculture, Tom Carey. Prefers and may require a tree of heaven, but we're finding extremely wide host range for it. All right. Those of you who are unfortunate enough to live in spotted lanternfly land probably know a lot of this already. So the first through third stages are black with white spots, typically going to be found from late April into early June. They hop very quickly, very readily. Even though they look very conspicuous, they're not always easy to see out in the field. Then in about the middle of June, they molt to this fourth stage of this red coloration. Again, they're still really good at hopping, but you can sometimes come across clusters of them on twigs and branches. And they also have this projection out of the front of their head during all stages, and that's where the mouth parts are attached. So they do have piercing, sucking mouth parts. So the adults are going to start occurring sometime in about the middle of June. And so you see these clusters of that. And you can see kind of why they got their name. You can see the spots on the wings. The lanternfly part is a little bit of a misnomer because they don't glow. They belong to a group of plant hoppers known as Fulgoridae or Fulgorids that are so colorful that entomologists of the tropics name them lanternflies. Again, they don't glow. So the spot part is about the only thing that really kind of sticks, but they're very, very distinctive. And we've had a number of very successful master gardener citizen science detection programs. Some of you here listening maybe have participated in that, but the master gardeners in Northern Virginia has been very instrumental as far as helping us delineate and figure out where this insect is spread to. We have a number of publications. This is one. This is the life cycle publication for spotted lanternfly, but you kind of get an idea. I don't dwell too much on this because you can download this off of the web. But hatch is going to be late April, early May. The adults are going to be appearing sometime in the beginning of July, and the egg laying starts sometime in the middle of August. The middle of September. So you have a 2-month time period between the first adult and the beginning of egg laying. An unfortunate aspect of this spotted lanternfly is that during that 2 months between the first adult and the first egg laying, they're dispersing. So they're very good at dispersing, hitching rides, flying away, that sort of thing. So that unfortunately aids in their spread. This is the host list. I'll give you all about 5 seconds to memorize it, but you don't have to because they feed on just about everything. And so some of the main ones on there that are really important, of course, are tree of heaven, but they really like maples. They show up in walnuts, sumacs, grapes. They can be serious damage on grapes. So they will feed, they'll lay eggs and all these hosts. So that is kind of, first we had, it's a good hitchhiker. It spreads very quickly. And now it also it feeds and lays its eggs on a wide range of plants. See a little bit of damage there in that picture, and that is the honeydew or the sooty mold. The honeydews land on the foliage, and the sooty mold grew on that. That's real typical for spotted lanternfly. So again, it's just kind of something that has taken over my life. Hopefully it's a long time before it gets to your county. This is the situation we're starting to see in Winchester, where you get so much spotted lanternfly feeding that the honeydew is just raining down from the tree, from the spotted lanternfly. It lands on the bark, on the ground. The sooty mold grows there. You can actually get so much honeydew, there's sugar in the ground, it ferments, so it often smells like vinegar or fermentation. There you actually see patches of yeast sometimes on the trunk. So it's a quality of life issue. You start to get backyards start to look like this for spotted lanternfly. All right, so another insect that kind of took over my life. So, like everybody else, I'm working from home during the pandemic, and I think people are very willing to be distracted by something else, and we had a detection of a giant Asian hornet, and that common name might change. This is a hornet that showed up in Washington State, and that detection then prompted a New York Times newspaper article that came out on Friday afternoon, and all the other news outlets in the planet wanted to run a story over the weekend. And so that was everybody's weekend, every entomologist and kind of weekend sort of crashed to an end. And we've then been answering hundreds, if not thousands of giant hornet questions. No, it's not Virginia, but there's some lookalikes, and I'll talk about those coming up too. The range is almost all over Asia. It's a very large size hornet. And it is, initially the record was just a single hornet was found about 10 miles with the Canadian border. I'll show you the map coming up there too. But they subsequently had some more finds in Washington State. So, and there's, you got to do a search on the news. There's a lot of stuff about these giant Asian hornets or murder hornets. So they, by the middle of summer, Washington State had been running a lot of traps for them, and they actually found the first one in a trap. So it was an indication there was possibly some activity in Washington State. So we will be running some traps in Virginia. I'll be keeping an eye out for it. If you're working in an extension office, people are going to be bringing in European hornets for sure to show it to you. Again, a very good size hornet, about 2 inches in length. This is the map. If you could kind of consider the very far northwestern tip of Washington State, this is where it's at. And then so just over the border is of course British Columbia, Vancouver, Victoria area, and that's where the records were, as well as into Washington State. So this is, you can see one of those it's red are the ones of detection. You see one that's fairly far south, that's a 10 miles south. So unfortunately, there seems to be sort of setting up shop there. It's ironic and not even a very funny way, but the entomologist at Penn State, he worked for Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, a guy was named Sven Svetcher, and Sven was there at Penn State or Pennsylvania when spotted lanternfly was detected. His wife took a job in Washington State. He went to Washington State and works for the Department of Agriculture there, and he was there when they first detected these giant Asian hornets. So anyway, the poor guy can't get away from these invasives. This shows you what they look like, some various stages. The queens are quite a bit larger. They do have these solid black bands on them. So there's some things that can kind of help you as far as separating them. If any doubt, extension offices can send pictures or something to my lab, and we can work from that. As I mentioned earlier, the kind of the two big ones we get a lot of inquiries about are going to be European hornet, which is actually also invasive, but it's been here for a couple hundred years. And it's actually the same genus, it's in the genus Vespa. And it has these sort of teardrop-like things at the end of the abdomen on the bands, and that's one of the easy ways to help separate it. There's a couple other things too you can do as well. The other one is the eastern cicada killer, and that shows up particularly in the midsummer. Pretty big size, but also gets confused with the Asian hornet. But it's a good thing when people are bringing these things to you because they got the right search image and they're looking for something. And so we take them all seriously and send back a serious response to it, because citizen science find a lot of things out there. And so we do know that a lot of these detections are made by just folks who heard about it and read about it and contact us. All right. Another thing in the news, if you lived in Southwest Virginia, where I live, I live kind of near Roanoke, kind of near the West Virginia line, and we had brood 9 of the 17-year cicada come out. So we kind of get a little pre-running, because starting this spring, most of Northern Virginia have brood 10, brood X. And so brood 10 is going to be out there making a lot of noise starting in about early May going into June. And you'll see them emerging, initially the nymphs, then they molt to come out of that shell. The shells will be all over the place, or cast skins. You'll see damage on the trees, like there in that picture with all this flagging, that sort of thing too. So they're already running news stories about brood 10. So it's always big time in the news too. This is the map here for what we expect for Virginia. And kind of a couple, or the one there, the smaller map there to the left is the one I put together. And that's based on records we have recently and in previous emergence. So it's pretty much all that northern tier of counties, predominantly most of the top two northern counties all the way across. So Shenandoah and Frederick all the way across to Fairfax. But we also put in some of those other counties in there too, because they kind of touch on the areas with it too. There may also be some emergence around Charlottesville and Southern Virginia, but mostly it's going to be Northern Virginia for where it emerges. So in parts of Frederick County, they're going to have both spotted lanternfly and 17-year cicadas. So look for information and press releases soon. So it'll be in the news. We'll try to have a cicada media day at some point as well too. So that'll be coming up. So a lot of the insects are all the insects, and the mites too, we talked about, all have piercing, sucking mouth parts. So now in the kind of remaining time, I'll kind of do a quick rundown on the chewers. And these are things like beetles and caterpillars. They're chewing on the foliage, skeletonizing, chewing away the leaves, that sort of thing too. They're the most conspicuous. They're often the insects with piercing, sucking mouth parts are kind of easily overlooked. So the beetles are extremely large group of insects, about 400,000 described species. It's the largest of all orders. About 25% of all known animal life forms are a species of beetle. So they are extremely successful, as we would say, as far as this group has been. They have radiated, adapted, evolved that you find them virtually every kind of ecological habitat or situation. They range from plant feeders to scavengers to predators to all kinds of things, or even some of their parasites. So they are extremely well adapted group and extreme amount of variation in them. The largest family are the Cuculionidae, which are your weevils, with about 70,000 member species. So again, a very big group, very successful group. They feed on everything, as I kind of mentioned, alluded to that earlier. So again, everything from fungi, scavengers to predators to plant feeders, and some are beneficial. I talked about some of these earlier, like the lady beetles are predatory and very beneficial as far as controlling a lot of pests. So just a few examples here pretty quickly. Asparagus beetles would be something you might see coming up. Like asparagus starts coming up, say sometime in April or so. And you might see these little black specks on the spears, and those are the egg stages of the asparagus beetle. The beetles themselves might feed on the fronds or on the, not really technically the leaves, but they're and on the shoots, but the eggs are going to be an issue. I used to grow a lot of asparagus, about 5,000 plants in the ground, sold it commercially. A lot of these egg masses, eggs will be on there. We just didn't sell those. It didn't bother me to eat them. My boys would call them flavor crystals. So anyway, but that's kind of, it's one of the interesting as far as pests are concerned. People are controlling it to stop the egg laying. But that's a example of a beetle to show you here. And another one here to kind of see real common in garden is Mexican bean beetle. It is invasive, but a little different. It's native to North America. It's found in Mexico in the south natively. But as people started having vegetable gardens, as farmers started to go more and more soybeans, Mexican bean beetle kind of hopped and flew its way back to the east. So now we see it as a fairly widespread pest. If it looks like a lady beetle, it is. It's one of the few with the plant-feeding lady beetles. 16 spotted adult is one way to distinguish it. The larvae are very unusual. They're these yellow things, these spiky, spiny things on their back. Fairly distinctive on beans as well too. There is a predator, the Pediobius. Does a pretty good job. It's very expensive though. If you want to be doing a Pediobius for control of Mexican bean beetle, you're looking at probably $40 to $80 per year because they don't survive the winter. Unfortunately, the Pediobius doesn't. Mexican bean beetle, obviously it does. So here's some of their damage. The skeletonizing sometimes falls out. So you get these sort of these window paney looking things there too. And their eggs are laid in clusters, little yellow eggs. They hatch. You get kind of another shot of what that spiny larval stage looks like there on the bottom part. But there over to the right, you can see a pupa. So it looks kind of unusual. And other lady beetle pupa look like that too. So, but that's that kind of a hemispherical look you'll see with other coccinellids or lady beetles too. Cucumber beetles, another beetle pest we see a lot of. The larval stage feeds on the roots. The adults feed on the fruit or the vegetables. They can also feed on the stems too. They kind of do some scarification there, or they damage the fruit pretty heavily. They can transmit bacterial wilt, so they can be a vector of a bacterial disease and be an issue that way. And they can be controlled a number of ways. Early plowing and late planting. If you can wait to plant your pumpkins and squashes until the middle of June, that will kind of reduce the number of these squash bugs. I'm sorry, these cucumber beetles that are out there feeding on squash bugs too. We'll get to that in a minute. Row covers do a pretty good job, and I'll talk about that here coming up as well too. Insecticides, you get more than 5 per plant. That kind of would justify doing some kind of insecticide treatment. But they're also pollinators. The cucumber beetles get inside the flowers and help pollinate. So it's kind of a little bit of double-edged sword when you're dealing with cucumber beetles. This is the row cover idea. My row covers never look as pretty as that. But the main feature is that you have some type of structure that holds the row cover off the plants, and then you have some way of tucking it into the soil. And these are spun polyester. There's various brands of them out there. But again, it's all the concept that you're not touching the plant, but you're not letting anything in there, but you're letting sunlight and moisture to some extent get in there as well too. Typically, you put them on there and leave them on until flowering. Then you pull it away so that the bees and other pollinators can get in there. So it excludes, works well, particularly on the 3 sisters for cucurbits, the squash bug, squash vine borer, and cucumber beetles. So exclusion is an option on some other plants too. And so that's kind of, if you weigh your garden set up or you have time to do that, that might be something to consider is using some type of row cover. Others too. Works best if you rotate the crops too. Colorado potato beetle, really common. It's native to North America, but it is native in the Rocky Mountains, the eastern foothills of the Rocky Mountains. And as settlers arrived with their potatoes, it switched from a solanaceous weed over to potatoes and then hopped its way east. Often people ask us, we got gypsy moth, we got spotted lanternfly, why are we getting this pest from other countries, and what have we given to the world? Well, Colorado potato beetle is one that ended up being accidentally introduced into Europe just before World War II and has become a very serious pest. Another one out there too is fall webworm. We see that on trees late summer, makes a webbing at the ends of the branches, and that got introduced into Asia, where it's known as the American butterfly or the American white moth, and it's a very serious defoliator. So Colorado potato beetle is a pest in our garden, but it's also gone worldwide. Larvae feed gregariously initially, and then they kind of spread out. These are all the larval stages here on this picture. There's the adult there in the top right, fairly robust beetle. You can hand pick or spray them. They tend to be resistant to insecticides, so it's very hard to control it. Katahdin potatoes show a little bit of resistance, but that's not 100% resistant. And then there's some versions of Bacillus thuringiensis, San Diego tenebriana strains, which is sold as Trident, M1, M-Track, Foil, Novador, etc. And these BT strains work particularly well on beetles. So that'd be an option to use for Colorado potato beetle. I used to pay my boys 10 cents a piece. The old way was a penny. That was too cheap, so 10 cents. Well, they made a lot of money off of me. So, but hey, they're out in the garden, and that was fine too. I still hand pick as many as I can when I'm out there in the garden. Having garden therapy, so I got about a half-acre garden or so, and it's my golf game. That's what I like to do. Japanese beetle, another invasive. It's kind of a recurring theme where these invasive pests tend to be much more seriously arrive without their natural enemies and spread unchecked. So two stages that are important, they're both important for Japanese beetles. One is the larval stage, the white grub stage. There's a number of species of white grubs out there, but the Japanese beetle is probably the dominant one you'll see out in the yard and garden. The adult, very mobile, very characteristic. We all know what it looks like, and it feeds on the foliage of garden plants, fruit trees, and all those sorts of things too. So very wide host range. We kind of saw that with another pest, the spotted lanternfly. The Japanese beetle particularly does work very well on a lot of things. So you can check the turf for grubs. You see dead turf with that. Monitor for the adults and the preferred hosts. So again, things like fruit trees, roses, rosaceous type plants are all things that they really like. You handpick the adults, good luck. There's so many of them. You can control the grubs with milky spore disease, although no replicated university research on milky spore disease. A lot of testimonials, certainly no harm in putting it out. You may not get control in all situations, as they say. Chemical control is only partially effective because they're very mobile. They come in from a wide area and so you can kill them, but the more of them fly in. Traps are the same way. You can draw more traps into an area. So they sometimes say the best place to put the trap is in your neighbor's yard. But I really like my neighbors, so I don't think I'll do that one. But you do have to kind of worry about that drawing them in as well too. So it has become unfortunately a very big pest. People ask me, is next year going to be a big year for Japanese beetles? I'd say probably, unfortunately, they will do pretty well because we have adequate amount of rainfall last summer. So if you were in an area of Virginia that was really dry last summer, you may see a reduction in Japanese beetles. If you're in an area that had a lot of rainfall, particularly during July and August, you'll have very good Japanese beetle establishment and very good populations. Unfortunately, a big emergence next year. So a lot to do with your weather last year will tell you about what your Japanese beetle will be like this year. Talk about borers. I'll go through this really quickly here. Borers are mostly secondary. They show up on dead and dying trees for the most part. These are native borers. There's a few invasive borers that don't really follow those rules very well. Look for early color change, single branches dying, loose bark, sawdust. Those all would be signs of borers. You can remove the infested trees or debark once they're cut down, debark them. Check your neighboring trees, the same species for them too. Again, secondary, most borers show up in dead and dying trees, but there's a few glaring exceptions to that. Flat-headed apple tree borer, it's native, but it does show up as a pest. If you're driving through a new subdivision or a shopping mall that has new young trees planted, and you'll see this sort of wet wood like you see there to the right, that's usually damage from flat-headed apple tree borer. Name is a little misnomer because it feeds on a very wide host range, but that's a typical kind of damage. You pick that bark away, you would see the flat-headed apple borer in underneath there. Emerald ash borer. It's pretty much run amok and all across the state at this point. First detection 2003, although it really didn't get going until 2008, but it wasn't about 5 years later. It was pretty much statewide. You can see on that map, the only counties not filled in are very far southeast Virginia. There's not much ash growing down in southeast Virginia. There's a few pumpkin ash or like growing sort of on some of your hummocks or like there, but not much host range. That's kind of has limited it, but the rest of the state, unfortunately, has had it for a while. You can control them if you use systemics. There's a picture of Jason Fisher's or forestry extension agent in southern central part of Virginia doing a systemic treatment around the base of a tree, and it looks pretty low tech, and it really is. That's all you have to do. But if your tree is, but most of ash trees unfortunately have died out, become infested. So it is a pretty sad thing that we've lost most of these ashes across the state. We always keep an eye out for survivor trees. We hope maybe down the road to have some resistant trees, but right now it just doesn't look real good for ash trees. Another one that's in the news too, and particularly kind of popped up recently, is the Asian longhorn beetle. Particularly, there's a detection in Hollywood, South Carolina, which is real near Charleston, South Carolina. It's just a suburb kind of to the south of Charleston. And so that's the most recent detection. The most one before that was the one in southern Ohio in Batavia, near Batavia, Ohio. And so that was when we were kind of keeping an eye on. That was in 2010, but now we have this one in 2020. So it is on the news. We do get some lookalikes sent in. That's fine because we have the right search image, but just kind of keep an eye out for this one. We don't have any in Virginia yet, but definitely it's something. If there was ever an insect that could keep me awake at night, it would be the Asian longhorn beetle. A lot of information about it too. This is a few things about the damage you might see. That picture there in the center, the tree next to the truck, that's actually a infested tree. So the trees can be cryptically infested for a long time before they die. That pencil sticking out of the tree is the pencil test. You have these large holes with that lead into the galleries. You can actually see there in the damaged wood, but you can stick a pencil inside, and that's the pencil test for identifying it. But if you see anything like it, send it to me. I'm very much interested in seeing it. And then real quickly, the last couple minutes here that we've got, or 4 minutes, I'll just kind of brief rundown about the Lepidoptera, your moths and butterflies. Again, a very large group, about 180,000 species. And most of them are not pests. They're harmless butterflies, harmless moths, but a few of them do become fairly major pests. Immature stage of butterflies and moths are called caterpillars, obviously. They have chewing mouth parts, these mandibles that go back and forth, and they tend to kind of go on the edge of the leaf and chew inward, making these notches. Very characteristic kind of a damage for them. Some years it can be outbreaks of some of them, they do very well. And so that tends to also be a characteristic for them. This is yellow-necked caterpillar, a picture taken by the recently retired Barb Leach, some of you may have worked with in the Roanoke area. So named for that yellow band behind the head. Generalist defoliator, it gets a wide range of plants and that sort of thing. Imported cabbage worm, kind of tells it all. It's not native, feeds on cabbage, it's a worm, etc. But it's actually kind of interesting. It's one of the few pests for the adult stages of butterflies. You might see those sulfur butterflies flitting around the garden, and that's the adult of the cabbage, of the imported cabbage worm. Armyworms get into whorls of plants and cause damage as the plant grows out. And then a few defoliators you see out there kind of in the forest are things like the gypsy moth there on the left. The top right is the eastern tent caterpillar. It's an early spring feeder you see like out in April. The bottom is the fall cankerworm. It's named by the activity of adults are in the fall, but the larvae, which are a type of looper, are feeding in the early spring. It's a real sporadic defoliator, so you can see fall cankerworm damage was happening 3 or 4 years ago, but we're kind of in a lull right now. So it's kind of dropped off, and that tends to be the case for it. We hope it stays that way, although in some cities like Charlotte, North Carolina, they've gone around to yearly continuous infestations of fall cankerworm. Defoliators, the woods are going to be characteristic. You get these pictures taken in the summer with all the leaves gone. That's what you see for things like gypsy moth, fall cankerworm, variable oak leaf caterpillar, another one that defoliates a lot in Virginia. And so eastern tent caterpillar can kind of cause the same kind of thing too. Here's damage, and well, starting with eggs on the left to larvae to the tent, the refuge they make, all the way to the adult eastern tent caterpillar. And so eastern tent caterpillar is predominantly going to be on black cherries and some fruit trees. Most of the time, the trees survive as cherry trees growing on the highway, get defoliated and put out leaves again. Prune the egg masses off in the winter. You can remove the tents manually. Apply insecticides to tents. The tents are a little bit waterproof. You kind of have to keep that in mind. the migrating last instar larvae, the full-grown caterpillars, they wander across your garden and can be an issue there. But they're, well, as far as just their appearance, but they're not really a pest. So, you know, it's not an issue. So that's, you know, that's kind of, we do get a lot of inquiries about there, but they're not a problem. And we don't recommend that you burn the caterpillars out of the branch. I think we've all seen neighbors doing that, but I'm sure none of us listening in today have ever done that. But it's you're likely to damage the plant as far as even more than what the caterpillars have done. Bagworm, really common right now. They're overwintering. About half of them are empty because the males left. The other half have the egg masses inside, and you can hand pick them off right now. I'm particularly trying to get the ones that all have the eggs inside. Hand pick, etc. So I'm kind of running low on time here. Trying to get the last things pretty quick. Hand picking the bagworms now. Otherwise, you're looking for an insecticide sometime in late May, early June, depending where you are in Virginia. It's very important timing on bagworms. We always get inquiries and people talk about August or so. What can I do? Nothing. Nothing in August or even July really are going to work very well. They're just too big, the bag's too protective, nothing works. So the main thing is kind of get an eye out for them. They're really tiny, they're just hatched, and put those sprays on sometime late May, early June before first start to see some type of activity. All right, I think that's the last. I've run out of time. I can't talk about giant grasshoppers. So anyway, so that'll kind of finish up. And I know I had to run through a lot. Normally I'd do this whole thing with lots more slides in about 2.5 hours. So I appreciate your patience on me running through and hope that sometime down the road I can see you all in person. But right now this is what we'll work with. So do a stop sharing. And I guess Kathleen.
Yes.
So
some questions in. So I think the last, maybe we have about 10 minutes or so till the end of our session. So I can go through as many as we can, but thank you for a really great and informative presentation, which will hopefully be really great for our Extension Master Gardeners moving forward throughout this year and helping their clients. So we really appreciate your time here this afternoon. So going through some questions, we had a few questions about mites. So the first is, how do mites travel from location to location?
They are getting blown about by wind. They're hitching a ride on bird legs. They can get moved with plants. Transplants can carry them. So they're not, I think naturally they're not going to be able to walk very far. Sometimes you say drag a garden hose through the garden. You can move them that way. There's famous aerial pictures of consultants scouting soybean fields for mites, and they walk through, and you can see the pattern where they walk through. So it's mostly hitching a ride maybe on your clothing. They're not pests of humans. They don't bite us, but that's going to be the way. One way, I think it's mostly going to be wind. You typically have infested plant, and then downwind from there, you see a lot more that are become slowly infested.
Great. Next question about mites is, are you aware of a mite that might cause yellow or white spots and stippling in rosemary leaves or needles?
Yeah, it would be one of the spider mites, and most likely the two-spotted spider mite. If you're not sure, you can send a sample in. We can go from there. But the most common one you get on herbs and vegetable gardens, greenhouses, it could be a two-spotted spider mite. So that would be my best bet. And for rosemary, you can put insecticidal soap down. It'll do a pretty good job. It's labeled for use on herbs, and you wouldn't have to worry about a wait period. The thing about insecticidal soap is you can harvest the same day you spray.
Great, and that is a good introduction to the next question. Can insecticidal soap be made at home from ingredients you have around the house?
Highly illegal. No, just kidding, but not. It is. You have to follow the pest management guide, and you have to apply. You have to follow by the label. So, insecticidal soap it's a product that you purchase and that you mix it up and use it according to the label. The home remedies are not legal. It's not like we're going to be barging down your door with an arrest warrant, but it's not a legal use. part two on your home remedies for soap is a lot of your soaps are phytotoxic. In other words, the soaps are toxic to the plants. So you're also very likely to come some type of plant injury that may even be worse than the mites. So again, as master gardeners, you're training, you'll be working on the plant line or plant clinics or whatever at your office. You have to, it has to be, your recommendations have to be from the pest management guide and on what's far as what's legal. So it's kind of, I hate to be the quashing, home remedies, but that's one that potentially can have some issues for you.
Great, thanks for that. Do insecticidal soaps have any harm towards beneficial insects, or do they target specifically the insects that we would not want on plants?
So insecticidal soaps work on soft-bodied arthropods, so it'll take out your pests like aphids, thrips, and mites. It'll also take out your beneficial, so your predatory mites, your predatory thrips are all going to be taken out with it too. So I think as far as soft-bodied insects, the insecticidal soap is kind of broad spectrum. So you may have removing the natural enemies as well too. So it's always a little bit of a balancing act. If you're really seeing not much in the way of natural enemy activity, then you're pretty good on doing some type of insecticide or insecticidal soap treatment. But yeah, it could take out some of the beneficials. Now, things like lady beetles, not likely to get taken out too much, but still there could be a mortality factor with them too. So, insecticides generally, even your organics, even your botanicals and the like that are labeled for insecticides tend to all be pretty hard on your beneficial insects.
Great, thank you. Could you talk a little bit about dormant oil and how it's best used?
So dormant oil is an emulsifiable petroleum. Now it is considered certified organic, although comes from the same as petroleum from the ground. So it's emulsifiable, so it has things added to it so that with agitation, the dormant oil goes into solution in a tank for spraying. The dormant oil is named for its use during that dormant stage of the plant, although there are some summer sprays that are available out there, a little more refined oils and the like too. Generally, dormant oils are used to smother insects and mites. You would put it on there. It's going after the overwintering egg or whatever stage is overwintering on the bark or sometimes on the evergreen leaves or needles. And so providing control by sort of kind of smothering action. So dormant oil too can sometimes be an issue for really tender growth. That's another reason why it's done during the dormant stage. You would typically in Virginia be thinking about dormant oil application sometime in, say, from mid-March to the end of March. So that kind of late winter when the temperature a little bit kind of the moderate side, late winter, early spring, and but the plant buds haven't broken yet. Now there are some things like sun sprays, which are actually a type of petroleum oil that are a little safer to use on plants. Just follow the label, see what they recommend as far as what you can do. Generally, things you're controlling, things like mites, aphids, scales, can be the things usually typically control with dormant oil.
Great, thank you. Do you know of any good places to buy egg masses for praying mantids or ladybugs?
I'd just say look online. There's another number of companies that sell beneficial insects, and so you just kind of would have to shop around. You might check with if you have a Christmas tree grower nearby that you might check with them. I know a lot of the Christmas tree growers will pull off the praying mantis egg masses off of their trees and put them aside. So you might check with that. I would look along field borders, field edges. You often see those tall weeds this time of year on those field borders, field edges that have praying mantis egg masses on them too. So that'd be the way I would go. Don't bring them inside until, at all, I would say, because they'll hatch and they'll be eating each other, unfortunately.
All right, the next question is about grasshoppers. So we had one participant who noticed more grasshoppers this past summer. So what sort of damage do they cause, and to what plants are they mostly a pest?
So grasshoppers were in order. I didn't mention the Orthoptera, but the grasshoppers are generalist feeders. They feed on with chewing mouth parts, on leaves, and they are predominantly going to be feeding on grasses. So you can see fairly high populations in places like hay fields and the like. If you, depending when mowing is done, then the grasshoppers can then kind of move in and move over from hay fields and like over towards gardens. That's the most kind of common way you see grasshoppers moving. They are related also to the kind of overwintering. So if you get good overwintering conditions for these things, they lay their eggs in the soil actually, and then you can see higher numbers of grasshoppers. So we do kind of see them sort of popping up kind of in different locations in the state. Not always a problem every year, but some places that kind of show up with grasshoppers. But in real generalist feeder, typically again only coming in the garden and yards as they kind of run out of food other places in the landscape.
All right, next question is about squash borers in the garden. So do you have any suggestions for how to prevent them in people's gardens, or if they're there, how to take care of them?
Yeah, that was one slide I kind of took out. But the thing about squash vine borer is that those row covers I mentioned are going to be pretty effective for it. They'll kind of keep them from coming in and landing on the vines and laying eggs. Then that's kind of the issue for them. They'll fly in and lay an egg, and then the larvae then hatch and bore inside the stem very quickly. So you really have a very tiny little window to do control. You don't do the row covers. You have to keep an eye on it. As soon as you see activity, then you're spraying some kind of insecticide at that point. It could be botanical, or organic or non-organic, but the main thing is to get insecticide applications down. As soon as you see the activity and repeating as many times as the label will let you, usually about every 10 days or 2 weeks is when you're doing that, and just kind of going in and spraying again and again. So that's kind of, I think some people kind of reaction, they overplant, they plan to put in some extra zucchini plants, and then that's the year the squash vine borers don't show up and you're bestowing the gift of zucchinis on your coworkers. So either the row covers or the repeated insecticide applications once the activity starts.
Great. And we have one last question I think we have time for. So one of the participants was curious if there is a publication focused specifically on beneficial insects and resources around them that's through VCE or another cooperative extension.
Very good idea, and we probably should definitely have something like that. It's a question we always get a lot on, and we do have the Virginia Pest Management Guide, the home vegetable section, Pest Management Guide 18 home grounds. I've got a section in there on beneficials that you might come across in the garden or ones you can purchase. So I encourage you to take a look at the home grounds vegetable section and look at the beneficials in there. There's also other lists of organics in there too. And so a lot of the things I covered and talked about today are go a little bit more detail in there as far as, say, cultural control methods, exclusion, and as well as chemical control recommendations. So I would kind of dip into the pest management guide and look it up that way. And Kathleen, I can send you a link to that maybe you could share with folks too.
I actually just put a link to the home grounds and animal PMG in the chat box. So for anybody who needs that, it is there. And then it's also very easily searchable to find that publication on the VC website. You can't find it, talk to your volunteer coordinator or your local extension agent, and they can also get you a copy, whether that's a digital or can loan their hard copy to you. All right, well, I think that takes us to the end of our time today, Eric. Thank you so much for joining us. This was a really wonderful session, and we so appreciate taking the time with our Extension Master Gardeners.
Well, thank you for having me on, and I think this worked okay. I'm really looking forward to the time when I can come and see you all in person, but I think this works for now, and hopefully I kind of get you started on thinking about good bugs and bad bugs and dealing with them. So thank you for having me on.
Thanks so much. Thanks for joining, everyone. I did put in the chat box our next 2 weeks, so I hope that we'll be able to see you for the next 2 sessions. We have the weed identification clinic next week and the plant disease clinic the week after that. So 2 more sessions in the series, and we are excited to have them join us. Thanks, everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon.